get started. We have a good half dozen people here in the flesh, and we'll probably have some people show up a little bit later. And we have, looks like about 10 people on the call. We wasn't expecting a huge turnout for this. We did warn people this wasn't going to be a late conversation. We really want to spend some time with, I like the way Julio described it, with our power users of Project Connect data to really try to answer as many of the detailed technical questions as we can. I'll let Kyle talk a little bit more about this, but I'll give you my impression. One of the challenges that we have faced with this project, again, at least from my perspective, is that there's so much data, there's so much technical work going into this that it's been very difficult for us to take the time to fully explain everything in as much detail and get to every question shortly after it's asked. But we are getting caught up and trying to address every single question that was posed to us through the first phase of the Central Corridor study, and this is part of that effort. Again, we know some people have been scrutinizing the data and the methodology and the process closer than others, and that's what we wanted to have the discussion for those folks who are really taking a deep look and have the kind of detailed questions that maybe a public meeting isn't the best venue for, because we'll lose people. So that's what we're here for today. We don't really have an agenda other than to listen to you and to hear your questions and try to answer as many of them as thoroughly as we can. For those of you on the phone, I'll mention those of you who just jumped on, this is being recorded. If you have questions or concerns, there should be in the webinar screen a little icon with a hand on it. What I'm going to ask you to do, because typically in these webinars we make you type in a question or a comment, because these are probably going to be very technical, we're not going to make you do that. I hope you have you're either on your phone or have a mic attached to your computer. What I will do after you raise your hand is I will unmute you and let you just ask your question verbally, so you don't have to type out a bunch of stuff. And this is all being recorded for posterity and to go up on our website for those who really have a bout of insomnia, I'm sure. So with that, why don't we go around the room, since there's few enough of us here, and maybe introduce ourselves. I'm John Michael Cortez. I'm on the Project Connect team. I work here at Capital Metro, but most of my time is spent on Project Connect these days. But I'm the community involvement manager here for Capital Metro. Javier, you want to?
I'm Javier Arguello, Director of Long Range Planning for Capital Metro.
Martha Smiley, I'm on Citizens Advisory Commission.
I'm Roger Baker. I'm a long-term transportation student.
I'm Ali Khani. I'm a researcher at the Center for Transportation Research in University of Texas.
I'm Henry, former Capital Metro board member, former Capital Metro employee, a transportation planning consultant, and I'm here representing the Texas Association of Public Transportation.
I'm Dave Dobbs. I'm the publisher of Light Rail Now, which is the project of the Texas Association for Public Transportation.
I'm Roger Cobbin. I am on the board of Movability Austin and the founder of the DADNAB text messaging service for planning trips on public transportation.
I'm Scott Gross with the City of Austin Transportation Department. I'm the Project Connect Central Corridor Deputy Lead.
I'm Kyle Fahey. I'm the Central Corridor Program Lead.
Mary Smiley, URS, the consultant support.
And we also have Derek and Allison joining us from URF, supporting Jerry as well, and others in the room.
I'm John Lewis, with Capital Metro, and part of the Project team. Let me ask, since you two what's the hashtag for this thing in case anybody wants to tweet about it? Hashtag AskPCC. All right. PC.
Not too many seats.
I manage the board of directors. Okay.
All right, well, that was everyone.
I think that's everyone. And we have Ed Wallace, Greg Kylo, Jill Fagan, Kevin Johns, Larry Halford, North Lamar Neighborhood Team, Susan Pantel, and Tyler Bedune. Hope I'm saying that right, on the telephone. Okay, Kyle, you want to kick off?
Well, first of all, I want to thank everybody for joining us, whether you're here in person or on the phone with us today. You all have been part of a great journey that we've been on for the last several months to take a look at the Central Corridor and to examine various sub-corridors as we define them, geographic areas that allow us to take a look at which one of those sub-corridors allows us to make the next best investment for high-capacity transit. And as most of you, I believe, are aware of, we've gone through a lengthy data collection effort, data analysis as well. And then we have, as of last month, we can say now, since December, and last month, in the middle of the month, we put forward a recommendation that actually was a combination of two sub-corridors, East Riverside as well as Highland. And from our analysis of the various data points that we were able to collect, East Riverside consistently ranked at the top of our evaluation. Highland ranked consistently second, and there was a pretty strong, a little bit of a separation between the top two and the third, fourth, and fifth that were grouped fairly tightly. So we've made the recommendation to the Central Corridor Advisory Group to consider pairing the recommendation, pairing the East Riverside Corridor and the Highland Corridor to move into Phase 2, which would be a more detailed examination of an alignment or alignments as well as a modal analysis. And so today, what we wanted to be able to do is to be able to open up the discussion with you as to responding to any questions that you may have about how we were able to collect the data, how we analyze the data, and to be able to make sure that there's an opportunity for us to collect your questions, make sure that we have a conversation about your views about how we were able to put that information together and to develop a recommendation. And so, as John Michael said at the beginning, we really don't have a prescribed agenda. It's very much open, free form. I've done everything roll up my sleeves. So we're happy as a team to be able to have a conversation with you and see where the conversation takes us. We have until what time, John Michael?
I believe till 1:30.
So we're here until then, and we are scheduled to meet with the Central Corridor Advisory Group this Friday, at which point in time we will recap the recommendation. We will also have an opportunity for some public comment during that meeting as well. But we do expect a very good discussion amongst CCAG members regarding the recommendation and any crafting that they wish to do with it. We'll have a lot of questions and answers at that point in time, I'm sure. But the intent is that the CCAG would actually take an action, take a position on the recommendation, and be able to move forward in the process. So that's kind of where we are with our efforts. Pretty broad net that we cast today, and we'll just open it up to any questions that you have, and wherever you'd like to go, we'll go with you. So Lyndon?
Let me, I should have passed this out before. Can you just take
call thing up here so the people on the computer can hear, so speak up as much as you can.
Okay, so this is Henry here. I have quite a few questions that I've put out in printed form. I've also put them up on our Austin Rail Now blog, all dealing with the issues that have arisen around both methodology and data in the urban rail study. And as probably most of you know, I have quite a number of problems with the approach that has been used. However, I have a burning, just a burning fact question that I'd like to get out because I just haven't been able to find an answer for it. In your analysis of these different, I call them sectors because I don't really see those as corridors, as you know. At any rate, whatever you want to call them, sub-corridors or sectors, one of the things that you do is, in the course of the study, is to tally the total transit current boardings in the corridors or in these various sections. You should have some kind of a breakdown of that by route number. And I haven't seen anything like that. And the reason for that is one of the problems I have with the whole approach of this study is that rather than focusing on travel between these different sectors and the core, which seems to be the main purpose of the whole study, you've been focusing on travel everywhere. It just, I call it a helter-skelter approach. So you're looking at travel in every possible direction. I wanted to get some breakdown of that. For example, in virtually every one of these corridors, you've got both cross-town routes that don't go to the core, and you have a number of routes that do go to the core. And I'd like to get some breakout of that. So here we are in Capital Metro's main offices. It looks like that ought to be pretty handy. And I'm just wondering if it's not possible. It would be wonderful if I could come away with it today, but at any rate, I would like to get either a reference to that where it's available or be able to get that data.
And that data meaning, sure,
Breakdown by boardings, yeah, by civic route. Right. Did you all work with that at all? Or
talk about that? Absolutely. Scott?
Well, go ahead. I mean, we are in the process of plotting. I mean, typically in planning with areas where you don't have defined routes in mind, you do look at boardings at stop locations, irrespective of the route, because you're trying to get a feel for the amount of demand and the amount of usage in an area for transit services. So that was the original metric that we used. And because not all subcorridors have a defined route that traverses them, at least longitudinally or radially from the core, it would be difficult to compare throughout. On the other hand, we have been now working with Capital Metro to map routes, and hope to have them later this week. And we've done some preliminary mapping, but like I said, we hope to have it this week.
But I guess the thing that goes back here too is, if all we were interested in, Lyndon, were just the bus routings, just the boardings, that'd be a pretty simple study, and we'd be done. We'd say and it goes to many of the points that I've heard you raise is, MAR has the most ridership, therefore that's where we should put it. But this investment is looking at the next investment. That is an important input into it, and we have looked at it. We've looked at the origin and destinations between people in our sub-corridors to the core as well. And so we are looking at those trips. We're also looking at regional trip making, as how are they being oriented towards our core as well. But
we looked at this from the geographic area, taking a look at a broader perspective than just looking at it from a route standpoint. But it has been, as Scott said, we are pulling that information together because it has been requested. I don't know if there's anything else you'd add to that, Jerry.
And I mean, I'll add too. I mean, it like Kyle's saying, it's part of the picture. I mean, you know, hopefully this is a system that will attract new riders that would not otherwise be reflected in the current ridership data.
Yeah, well, of course. The basic problem that I've had all along is that the study has never focused on any actual travel corridor. You have not looked at the travel density in these major corridors that do go into the core. You've tallied congestion on various arterials in all directions and added it up in these different areas. But as far as focusing on where there's a flow, you haven't done that. And that's what has been done for certainly for the Guadalupe-Lamar corridor for about the past 30 years. They've compiled an enormous amount of information. They came to a conclusion quite a while back. As a matter of fact, when I came back to Austin, what was on the table was a central expressway that would have gone straight through down that corridor. And one of the main reasons I proposed that and proposed a light rail in that corridor was to try to offer an alternative that was a much more livable kind of alternative than reaming out the whole part of the city through what is now considered the Lamar-Guadalupe corridor. And of course, that's been successful. We basically stopped that expressway or that freeway from going in. But, that corridor has had a tremendous amount of focus on it as a corridor, as a travel corridor. And one thing that has disturbed me is that we've gone through this whole process now, months and months and months, and really none of that has fed into the actual process of looking at what's a viable public transit corridor. And obviously, it's not just who's currently riding the buses, but what you can attract both from existing general motor vehicle traffic and what you can attract in terms of the new trips generated. Which leads to my other question. I don't.
Hang on, Lyndon. Can I respond to some of those points? So in general, you know, we characterized kind of our approach as a little bit helter-skelter because we're looking at areas. We're sometimes looking at congestion or ridership, existing ridership that isn't necessarily in a radial nature. And in part because that gives us a better idea of what's going on in that subcorridor and recognizing that we don't know what route, what alignment would actually work for a given subcorridor. There have been proposals in the past, but you know, many of them haven't been implemented for a variety of reasons. So the reality is that the ability to move, for instance, laterally within a subcorridor is important. If you're going to avoid congestion or if you're going to look at alternate alignments, we're more concerned with origins and destinations rather than what actual path somebody takes. Because the reality is that path is a function of what else is going on in that subcorridor. It's a function of where the service is. If you're going from here to here and you're taking this path today, you may take another path if it suits you better, travel time-wise or frequency-wise, or if because there's construction here. So we did not want to limit ourselves to looking at a particular street when we're considering travel patterns. More about where people are trying to go, not how they're getting there.
Each one of these is based on that concept of a travel shed. That's each one of these. If you look at East Riverside, it's the East Riverside corridor. If you look at Lamar, it's Lamar and Vernon. So it's not that we're actually taking a little broader perspective, I would think, than what you're suggesting. What I think you're suggesting is that we look specifically at Lamar What we're saying is we looked at the area of the people that would live in that general travel shed and would have a tendency to use Lamar. So that's just one of the different approaches that we've used.
Can I just, I think where Lyndon's coming from, I don't think it's quite been addressed here. Where Lyndon's coming from is, if you're
Roger Cobb.
Yes, sorry, Roger Cobb. If you're trying to analyze transit demand that's going to go along, ultimately go along a certain corridor, you want, if you have data that shows that there is travel demand specifically to get from one sector to another sector versus just travel demand that shows data that shows that there's lots of boardings at one and lots of boardings at another that aren't necessarily going to each other. That's very different. One is a much more reliable indicator of this is the travel demand to get from here to the core and to wherever, to whatever.
And that's why we used origin destination data to fill that need, rather than looking at routes, which don't necessarily correspond directly to the sub-corridor. Some routes traverse all the way through. I mean, you can parse it to know when. Again, this is, probably more important is the overall demand for travel between one area and another. So that's captured in the travel data, not in the existing transit ridership data. So we've just approached it. I mean, we recognize the importance of that. We've just approached it in a different fashion because, again, no one piece of data is going to tell us where to go.
Okay, now that allows me to segue into the question I was going to raise before, which is why, if you're looking at travel demand and you're looking at the OD, the origin destination data from these sectors to the core, your matrix indicates that you're only looking at home-based work trips, which are your commute trip, your normal job commute trips. You're leaving out all of the home-based non-work trips, which, for the information of those that don't know, means all the University of Texas trips, all the trips down to recreation, to the bars and the restaurants and so forth, down in the core area. All of those kinds of trips are being left out when you do that assessment. And so I'm curious as to why you did that.
I believe we looked at both, all trips and home-based work.
You're only measuring the home-based work trips.
Yeah, home-based work is what we use as our evaluation measure.
And only by per square mile, I think.
I believe we've standardized it, yes. But we're focusing on home-based work trips because, that's where so many of our problems stem from, is that commute-driven demand for travel. You come to a different answer, potentially, if you were looking at all trips. All trips throughout the day tells you something different and is less detailed than the home-based work trips.
Yeah, well,
again, there's a lot of, you approach it from a lot of different areas, and that's why we have multiple measures, multiple criteria, because again, no one piece is going to tell you everything you need to know. I mean, if we just focused on all work trips, or on all trips, we could easily end up with a different sort of answer.
All trips are incredibly important, and in transit, for anybody that has ever operated in transit, we know this. The main reason is that it is actually pretty expensive to provide for all those peak trips, and that's why there's usually talk about extra charges and so forth for those peak trips.
Right.
The cream is all the other trips that you can get. You want those home-based non-work trips. You want those non-home-based trips.
Sure.
You want all those other trips. They're incredibly important. The data is in there. You actually have it in your matrix. And if you add the total, you'll look at the total trips. Lamar actually comes, the whole Lamar sector, I can't talk about the corridor because you didn't really analyze the Guadalupe-Lamar corridor, but the whole sector comes out looking much better than virtually any other sector in the entire of the entire study area that you looked at. And those trips, what that means is that you're able to use your resources more effectively. You see that with Capital Metro. It was when I was at Capital Metro. One of the things I really was, beating Todd's head about was to get those get off-peak service, get that additional service. I came in. We said we don't have the capacity. We had open capacity in the system. That's those off-peak trips. That's those home-based non-work trips and other trips during the middle of the day.
We get it.
You're ignoring.
We get it. We're not ignoring them. Rather than cream, we might consider them gravy.
In comparing the corridors. I'm sorry, you are.
If you're going to ask the question, let's
Hey, Derek, can you pull up the evaluation data?
And then I really want to give other people an opportunity to ask questions too. So.
Yeah, I mean, they're great questions, but again, we're not really focused. I mean, there's so many other factors that right now, congestion, commute-oriented trips, that would seem to be the highest priority for the region. We recognize the need to capture those other special generators, those other trips that occur throughout the day. But again, that's not necessarily the focus. That is more of a gravy, of an ancillary benefit. That's when it comes time to pick an alignment, is identifying those special generators and making sure that we have we're able to utilize the capacity that we create throughout the day.
Well, and the reason we looked at just home-based work, again, we're comparing across 10 subquarters because we related it back to our problems. Our problem here is congestion. When is the congestion really worse? During peak travel periods. Why? Because that's the home-based work trip. So without a doubt, as we define service, we'll be looking at how can we move in to capture all those trips. But in terms of responding to our congestion problem, we felt that the most effective comparative factor was the home-based work trip. So that's why you see us using that factor as looking at each one of our 10 subquarters.
And we know too the home-based school trips. I mean, given where given the realities of the shuttle system, a lot of that's already being served. A lot of those trips are originating from West Campus. So that would actually distort that distorts things a little bit, I think. That if we focused on addressing, trips from West Campus to main campus, I think we would shortchange the community.
You're talking about trips from all these outlying sectors. Lamar over here, you've got Mueller that goes up almost entire northeast Austin, you've got East Riverside, which goes as far as past Pleasant Valley Road and Old Tarpon. So you've got these huge areas here, and you're talking about the trips from there, of course, not the West Campus. As a matter of fact, the West Campus is cut out of everything in terms of that, because you consider that part of the core, I would call the core sector or core area. And so those aren't even...
But you had cited the home-based school trips.
Yeah, and a lot of those trips are made from a distance. And also important here are the trips that are made for recreation. This is the party city. I mean, you've got plenty of people coming in for recreation. And I think I'll just go. We may agree.
But we don't have the ability to measure that. I mean, that's not something that is really effectively modeled with the Campo travel demand model. It's the travel special event trip generation.
Let's move on to somebody else.
Okay.
Again, we want to make sure everybody gets a chance to answer a question. For the folks that are online, I want to remind you, if you have a question or a comment, just click on the hand icon, and we'll unmute you, and you can ask your question. Roger, so did you have a question?
Yes, I understand that on East Riverside Drive you have transit rider projections of 2.9 million in the future. Is that accurate?
Yes and no. We're not really projecting that. We're using a proxy for ridership. So we can't do ridership because we don't have defined projects in each subcorridor. But what we can do is we can use a proxy. We can use somebody else's methodology from TriMet, their Transit Orientation Index, which does estimate the total amount of transit ridership based on land use. So it's not ridership for a particular project. And what it does is it calculates a score, and then the scores are translated into ranges of predicted ridership per acre. We're only using the scores because they're linear, and 8 is only one more than a 7. However, if you look at the range of ridership that a 7 would predict versus an 8, you end up with something that's more geometric or exponential in scale. So we don't use that, but it's part of the methodology, so we included those calculations. And so in our evaluation data sheet, we have the range for each score. So yeah, it predicts 2.9. And what we're saying is, see, it does that. That's why we're using the score.
And again, what I want to know is where we can go see if the methodology that resulted in that number is accurate and plausible. Where did these projections originally come from?
So TriMet, this is the table from their methodology. We have the documentation that's posted on our website, so you can dig into it. But so you can see that what happened was East Riverside was scored a 9 at the low end of 9, and unfortunately, we had to plug in a number for infinity. So that 2.9 million is based on our infinity number.
Well, these are still.
But again, we didn't use it in the evaluation. It's part of the data because it's very easy to calculate, and we wanted to give that kind of perspective. Here's an empirically based methodology that somebody else developed. We think it's a reasonable proxy for ridership and a way to compare.
What I wanted to know is where I guess these are home-based work trips, 2.9.
No, it's just all transit trips. It's predicted ridership per acre is what the methodology.
Okay, where did the original numbers come from that tell us how many people are going to be there in the future?
Okay, so what it uses is it's based on current demographics. It uses households per acre, employment per acre, and retail employment per acre. So those are not based on demographic projections. They're based on basically cleaned up census data. Census data for population, and then cleaned census data for employment. So it went through the Texas Workforce Commission and then Campo before we touched it.
Well, how do we know that there's going to be this many people and that demand? At what time in the future is this?
Well, this is based on current. This uses current land use and current densities.
So we're saying that the current travel demand ought to be 2.9 million a day?
Well, actually, I guess we calculated a current and a future. So we did calculate it based on the projection.
Where did you get the future data?
The future data, those are projections. We have the methodology is now published on our website as well. So we follow basically Campo's general methodology for making demographic projections and then allocating that throughout the city.
Well, how accurate is that, approach known to be? Can we look up transportation journals and see this is a pretty accurate way? Because I have a lot of questions about compost data. Compost data underlies what you're doing. So how credible is compost data? Is this from the 2035 plan?
Well, no. We're now using the same methodology that Campo will be using for the 2040 plan. I mean, it's the same basic approach, and it's just the allocation tools change over time, but it's the same basic parameters that have been used for 2035 for the 2035 plan that will be used.
Let me make a comment.
Sure.
The 2040 plan, which is where you say you're getting your assumption,
I'm not getting them from the 2040. I just need to be, in case Campo is out there and listening, we're ahead of the curve with Campo. Campo is still in development of that. The city, generally, Travis County, Williamson County, Round Rock, everybody in the region participates with Campo in doing the demographic projections. So the city helps establish what that methodology is. Campo has a new allocation tool that they're still learning how to use that considers these same parameters. So we're using the same basic methodology, but it's not theirs, just so we're clear.
Well, I would just say that if you're planning to use the same methodology that Campo's using, they're planning on putting 70% of the 2040 growth not only outside of Austin, but outside of Travis County. That's extreme suburban sprawl growth. If we're using that kind of thinking and coming up with this plan, and also managing to inflate the future demand for the East Riverside corridor to equal, apparently, more than the entire current transit demand in Philadelphia and what other.
Hang on, Paul. See, we're not saying that that is the predicted ridership. We're using a methodology that somebody else developed. It calculates out a prediction per acre. We included it, okay? Even if we didn't include it, you could have done the same thing. So we just felt that it was easy enough to include it. We didn't use it in our evaluation. So really, don't say that we're predicting this and we're using it, because we're not.
Well, if it appears as a number, then you are coming up with that number somehow. I just want to say that I don't trust Campo's future travel demands, because they are, they're planning on putting almost all the future population outside the city where it can't be served with transit. I think.
But see, what that would imply, though, is that then, because that's based on allocation of control totals, so the state demographer says, you're now 6-county region, you can grow by this much by 2040 or something, okay? And then Campo distributes that around the region. So if that's the case, then at the very least, what we're using are pretty conservative then for Austin. So that would mean that our own control totals would only be 30% of the region. So at least that should give some comfort.
Well, I want to know where the public can go to sort of kick the tires and see if all these numbers appear to be credible in terms of where they originated. I know that,
When we publish the source data, we published our methodology. That's how we've done it. Now, if you want to compare how our MPO does it versus other MPOs, that I don't really have a good guide.
I don't care if you publish the data. I want to make sure that I can see that it's reasonable, and to assume that we're going to have the travel demand equal to all of Philadelphia and Chicago in the future.
We're not claiming that we're going to have the travel demand equal to all of Philadelphia and Chicago.
If you come up with that number, you are.
So let me have another question, but I'll throw out there, have we ever underestimated travel demand in Austin, realistically?
Yes.
I think, yeah, I mean, they're projections, they're estimates, they're educated estimates of the future. The alternative is to put your head in the sand and say, let's just look at what's going on now. I mean, it is completely unreasonable to not try and estimate what's going to happen in the future. And I challenge you to find an MPO anywhere or a transit planner anywhere that just does all of their planning based on existing data.
So let me move to a question that
just real quickly. One question I think you're asking is where can you go to see where this is? This originated, this transit orientation index originated in Portland. They've had a number of projects that they've implemented. They've taken a look at how those projects were growing. They went back, they kind of did some reverse engineering, and they said, okay, let's take a look at where our growth is occurring and how our ridership is occurring in close association. And that's how they found these 3 factors. So if you really want to look at how this index was created, Portland is your city to go look at. They've documented this, and so we're using their documentation and applying it here using a similar methodology and just saying, okay, let's look at it and let's apply it.
Well, they're doing it for their entire transit network, their citywide network,
Right.
not on
We fully appreciate that.
No, what they did was a regression. They basically said, okay, well, we have high ridership here, we have low ridership here. What's common and what's driving that? They said these three factors: household density, employment density, retail employment density. Then they identified basically coefficients that associate them. And they said, well, if you have these kinds of densities here, that tends to translate to lower ridership. And they even say, go to the right. They even say what that ridership is akin to. An example, downtown Portland core or central. But the thing is, we use the TOI score as a relative comparison, a proxy for ridership.
They never proposed it that way, that you're going to compare one sector to the other on which is going to get a certain kind of investment. And if they had ever proceeded that way, they probably never would have built their initial line out to Gresham. It's a pretty...
This was a regression, so this came after the fact, okay? You can dispute it, but if you have a better proxy for ridership, we're open to it.
Well,
a better way to compare
ridership, the TOI actually is not a bad general indicator.
It's what we look at.
And your data for 2010, you're basically using essentially current era data. It looks pretty reasonable. It's when you get into these projections, back to Roger's point on the projections are in this thing are off the scale. They're absolutely off the scale. And where I see them as relevant, and you can say, oh, well, just did this miss that 2.9 million in East Riverside?
Dismiss it.
That, what you're doing is you're developing the TOI on the basis of your projections, because the household density, the employment density, and the retail density all feed into developing the TOI as an index, and then you apply that to the actual data, and it goes off, it explodes. It goes off and shows you that. That should have, you start telling you, wait a minute, our basic inputs here, there's something very, very wrong here. It should have been running back to Campbell and to the city of Austin or wherever the original figures are coming from, and saying there is something.
No, it's really more. There's shortcomings with the methodology. And again, the amount of predicted ridership per acre, we weren't comfortable with, so we didn't use it. We just used a relative score.
You didn't like what it was telling you, so you said, oh, well, let's sweep this under the rug. That's the way I'm looking at it.
We put it in the table. We're not sweeping it under the rug.
You got it in the table, and you decided not to use it as a measure.
Okay.
Also. But it's in that table.
Lyndon, we're obviously not going to get to a resolution on that.
Yeah, the point is, it in there because if you calculate it out, that's what it shows. But we didn't use those numbers. What we said was relative one quarter to sub-quarter to another. How did
tell you something? That's the thing. The numbers are telling you something.
No, it's an index.
The index
is
when you
Lyndon,
and you're getting
Lyndon,
numbers
you're not using those numbers. You didn't see us use those numbers in any of our evaluations.
John Michaels was trying to
Yeah.
somebody else into this.
Don't skin off my back. I just make somebody else wait. Look into her question. Susan asked, and I'm going to unmute you, Susan, because I think you might have wanted to add to this question. So I'll read it forward. She asked me to go ahead and read it forward. But I think this was referring to when we were talking about why we didn't look at specific streets or roads. Susan made the comment, realistically, there are only certain routes that are available for high-capacity transit. You can't put a route all over a sub-corridor only on a few particular roads like Riverside Drive, Lamar, Guadalupe, Red River, San Jacinto. That's realistic. Saying the route might go anywhere within the sub-corridor is not right. Susan, I think you're off muted. Mute, did you want to add anything to that before we try to address that comment?
And that was just addressed to what Scott was saying earlier about they're looking at the whole sub-corridor because the route could go anywhere. It could go this way and that way, and I'm saying realistically, no, it couldn't.
Well, I guess, Susan, I'll respond to that. No, not every street within a sub-corridor is something that we would consider a prospective alignment. But the reality is, even in East Riverside, I mean, we've looked at alternate alignments through there. You could utilize Lakeshore to some degree. So to, again, confine ourselves to a particular street when we haven't spent enough time studying it isn't going to necessarily get us any closer to the correct answer than looking at larger areas where we recognize, that a potential project could draw from. So, I mean, that's the main reason. And again, if you get into a particular alignment, that starts to raise other concerns. Now, now the expectation is to apply costs to them. But for instance, if we put an alignment on one street versus another, one street, we may be able to displace traffic. Another one, we may not be able to. But without being able to look at the traffic impacts, without being able to weigh costs and benefits of right-of-way acquisition and things like that, it becomes a real slippery slope, and you have compounding assumptions that, typically when we do transit studies, you start at areas, and you refine your focus until you're at the point where you can look at alignment. So that's why we did it that way. Well,
actually, in other areas of the country, they don't do it this way, and Lyndon has a really good post about that, showing how they actually look at the alignments. They compare the alignments, and I really have to say that I think the consultant time and staff time and money would have been far better spent comparing actual alignments. I really disagree with you, Scott, with due respect, but I disagree with your approach with the sub-corridor, and I really disagree that that's how it's done all over the country. Yeah, you look at the area and the region first, and then they focus on alignments, and they do consider things like costs. They consider actual bus ridership. I think that the approach you've taken for this study is not the best approach, and I think that's what a lot of the people in this room or on this discussion are trying to say. But in particular, I disagree with the sub-corridor approach. I don't think that that's the most helpful way to be studying.
Well, let me add to this. This is Kyle. You're right. At some point, you do get down to alignment, but that's after you figure out which direction you're going to make an investment in. Why are we doing this? Because 2 years ago, a project was put forward that would take an urban rail project to Miller. The question was, why Miller? And so why not somewhere else?
And it wasn't why Red River, for instance. It was why are you going to
Miller? What are the characteristics that really say in this region that we need to go to Miller? That was the nature of why we started looking at this. So so we've taken that step back, and it's Susan, isn't it?
Yeah,
Susan. So we've taken a step back, and we said, whatever direction we want to point that investment in, we need to be able to describe what characteristics it is that's going to allow us to move in that direction. So that's why we've approached it this way. And this is a very common way of doing this around the country. When you do understand that you want to make an investment, you have to figure out which direction you're going to put it. Once you start you've made that decision on which direction you're going to go, then you look at specific alignments. And that may be a street alignment. It may be a power line easement alignment. It may be a greenbelt alignment. It may be a railroad alignment. There are all kinds of alignments that you can look at not just streets. And Jerry and Scott and myself, we've all done that. As you, and Lyndon, you too probably, you've looked at all those options. Once you figure out which direction you're going to make the investment. So that's why we are doing this. It goes back to the very beginning that the community was not willing to accept a proposed project in Miller. So we've backed up and said, let's make sure that we understand which direction makes the best sense to us as a community. So we've done that, and we've laid that information out. And so it's about those characteristics. It's about population. It's about density. It's about employment. It's about economic development. It's about all of those issues. And once we've decided on which direction we're going to go, we will look at specific alignments. But you do not spend a lot of time looking at specific alignments all around an area until you've really focused where you're going to make that investment. So I want to make sure we dispel that that's just not something that we could afford to do. It's not prudent use of public tax dollars to look at defining 10 different projects and then figuring out which one it is. You need to figure out which one of those sub-corridors, in our case, sectors or whatever, which direction makes the most sense to develop that project.
All right, I just have a couple really brief responses. First of all, you know, we've been studying this in Austin for like 30 years. There's only a few, those 10 sub-corridors were never all realistic options. There's only a few realistic options that could have been studied. The second thing is, you said that we decided as a community, when you do those surveys and you go to the meetings, or you did that survey with the 7,000 people, the community keeps responding that Lamar is the preferred route. That's all I'm
No,
saying.
not necessarily. In that survey did not include at the televised community conversation. That did not include, you know, the bulk of the people that were on the phone.
That was the number you saw was just the people who were in the council chambers, which was dwarfed by the folks who were not in the council.
There were 100 people in the council chamber?
There were 45 or 50.
Oh, the count I saw was 101.
No, it also included, I'm sorry, you're right. It also included some people who may have been watching online and texting in online,
But most of the people were on the phone.
And Lamar was not.
But Susan, you know, I think the reality is there are lots of areas around town that could support high-capacity transit. And so I think you sell our community short by implying that there's only a few.
There are a lot of areas that can support it, but not realistically as a first investment. You know, you're not going to, just not realistic first investment. There are really only 3 options.
Well, you know, you can make a case for that. We started in 2010 or 2009 with a pretty narrow focus, and we were challenged by that. So that's why we included more areas and looked at all of Central Austin in this study. You know, we did not have any preconceived ideas about what it was going to be, and you know, we're fully prepared that Lamar could have ended up on top, and then we'd have a lot to wrestle with there. You know, we didn't know that Highland. I mean, Highland wasn't even on exactly on our radar within our study area when we started the study. So, you know, I think you have to give us a little bit of credit for approaching this with an open mind, and perhaps a more open mind than what we've heard sometimes from the community that's so focused on a single corridor.
Let me
hang on, Linda. Let's bring some other people in.
Yeah. Susan, was that everything?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Just want to remind people online, if you have a question or a comment, just to click on the little hand icon and we'll unmute you and let you ask it. Before we move on, does anybody else here have a question or a comment? Oh, I'm sorry. You have one. Sorry.
Oh, it was about the discussion we were having earlier on the lengthy discussion about the validity, the methodology, and the source of data which you didn't rely on seems to me to present a problem that we don't need to struggle with. I mean, why don't we take that out? Why don't we ignore it? Why don't we, if you tell me that something that looks very strange
Right.
is not something that you would validate or rely on, then why are we looking at it? That's my comment. And I don't see the value of it.
It's perhaps a lesson learned. But we felt like the index and the scores were a reasonable proxy and a reasonable way to compare subcorridors. The methodology provides a way to calculate the predicted ridership per acre. So rather than somebody else running in, hey, wait a minute, this is what this really means, you know, we just took the approach that it's easy enough for us to calculate it, we'll put it out there and not use it. Given another chance to redo it, we might rethink that approach. But we felt that, you know, since anybody could calculate it, why don't we just save them the trouble?
Well, I think it's going to be difficult to have a conversation without that popping up, and then it's difficult to explain.
Yeah.
So the question is there anything you could do with it now to contain the fact that it's there, and to make
Pull it off the table.
to say, you know, we didn't rely on it in the evaluation. We're not relying on it now. In fact, it was a mistake to put it in there. Let's take it out. What's the downside of that? It's just up to y'all.
Right.
I can't believe how much conversation's been around something that you didn't even rely on.
Yeah. Well, we tried to make that point, but I do think that one of the key points is it is the factor of looking at future ridership potential, and we believe that's an important aspect. But I think we can certainly take that into consideration as we go forward. Because I agree, it is problematic.
And we didn't present it correctly when it was initially posted. We had a field in that table that said, this is being used, this is being used, this is being used, and then other sets of data that were not being used. That didn't make it into the first posting of that data table. So there wasn't, unless somebody took the time to go through our matrix with the measures and then cross-reference them. So that was on us. I mean, that was the mistake. And now it's posted, and then it says whether it's being used in a calculation or whether it's being used explicitly as a measure. So we have taken some steps. You know, certainly I have no problem with erasing it, but you know.
And I think maybe it's brought on. You know, we've heard from the very beginning of this process that we need to be as transparent as possible.
Right.
Put everything out there. I think maybe
we've erred on that side. And when in doubt,
throwing everything out there, even without maybe taking as much time as we needed to make sure that people understood what was being used and what wasn't. Because we were erring on the side of caution on that one.
Yeah. You have one thing that you should know about Portland. Portland has the most stringent land use laws in the country, and maybe even rougher than Canada in terms of land use. So when you start looking at Portland, they can be more predictive because they have the ability to control where things go. We in Austin do not have that. Well, we all know that there are a lot of people who have assembled parcels along Riverside Corridor. We can't guarantee that they will invest and do anything with it, even if we build a train down.
But Dave, I mean, fortunately or not, their methodology, it may be a product of their land use regulations, but it's just looking at household densities, employment densities, and retail employment densities. Those were the factors. How they get there is another story.
It's the future that you have to worry about.
But again, the future that we're looking at is based on the same sets of data that we would project for the future, not using their methodology. So, you know, those are the same demographic projections that we're using elsewhere when we show what future densities we would expect. The same methodology, it's the basic methodology that Tampa uses.
The point I want to make here, first of all, Julio Altamirano has done an extremely good analysis of the total problem projections on his Keep Austin Wonky, I think is the name of his blog. And I certainly refer people to that. And also, we have a link to it on Austin Rail Now. What Julio has basically focused on is that the problem with the basic projection methodology is that it is trying to determine the likely maximum household to try to maximize everything. It tries to say that if you've got site plans, or if you've already advertised, or if you're just in a general plan or something like that, that's going to happen. That's a build out. What that's doing is giving you these astronomical demographic. You got three demographics. You got the household density, retail density, and general employment density. It's sending them out into outer space. And why I think this transit orientation index that Martha says, pull out of it, you probably do want to pull it out of it. But now it's there. If you do that, it's going to look like, let me finish here.
Do with the other, Linda. Where is it astronomical?
Scott, because you're projecting
outside of the TOI estimated ridership per acre. Outside of that, what about our projections for astronomical?
Okay. Well, for one thing, you're projecting incredible growth. It outstrips the heart of the city. You're basically saying you're going to get this huge growth over in Highland. You suddenly get, start having all this huge growth in Highland, but which is this concocted corridor that you invented, basically. And then in the East Riverside area, there's ERC corridor. There's the ERC sector out there. You're saying you got that huge. So the thing that gives that away is the transit orientation index, because that's where you're applying that data in to see that, okay, we've got this data, let's see what kind of ridership it's going to generate. My God, it generates 3 million riders a day in East Riverside. That should tell you something. That's more than Chicago and Philadelphia combined, the entire cities.
Is there a question there?
There's a definite question there. How could you do that? Why didn't you go back?
It's one factor. It's one factor. The TOI score for the future is one factor. The demographic projections that we've done, okay, the methodology that we use is reasonable, okay? We stick with current zoning and current land uses unless we have a future land use map for mixed use. That's the only time where land use is allowed to change in our demographic projections. And that's because, and I mean, part of what Julio was saying was that our methodology is all aspirational. It's not based on empiricism, or it's not based on experience. The fact is, the factors that we used to try and estimate or project what redevelops and at what density are all empirically based. It's based on what we know. We know that if you change something, a land use to mixed use, it's going to be more attractive than something that is strictly commercial, for instance. Okay, so I mean, everything, all of the allocation parameters that we use are all empirically based. Everything that we're doing in terms of what's going to change, it's all based on neighborhood plans, which have been incorporated into Imagine Austin. That is what's setting our goal densities. And you can call it aspirational, but the whole point of setting plans is to say, this is what we aspire to do. And not only do we think that's going to happen, we're going to set about making it happen.
There are ways to make projections that are conservative, based on realism, based on what is much more likely to happen than what we really want to happen. This is nothing but based on wishful thinking and targeted wishful thinking. Whoever is coming up with these projections say, we would like to have some growth over here and over here. And what's happening in
Austin. It's Imagine Austin is the plan that is driving.
We don't have the creative side.
Giving us way too much credit.
I agree with you. I think there is a tendency to have neglected the potential of the center city and what could very well happen, especially along the Guadalupe-Lamar corridor. There's huge amounts of land that is ripe for redevelopment there. I don't understand why the planning has not been focused on the potential of those areas. Instead, a lot of it is in the models, and yes, I agree, it's based on empirical data. It starts to almost, it all starts out, we don't go to, Lewis Carroll and Alice in Wonderland, hopefully. We base it on, real data to start out with.
I think your point's made. Let me ask what, I just want to make sure I understand what you're saying. You think that the redevelopment at higher density of the East Riverside corridor is wishful thinking?
A lot of it. I mean,
despite what's happening there today,
it's exaggerated. It's basically looking at what could happen, the potentials and so forth, but suddenly making that into, that's what's going to happen, so we're going to do that.
But why isn't Lamar, why isn't that just as wishful thinking? I mean, little Woodrows can't get built. I mean, you have
the answer to that is that when you look at transit ridership, and there's a report published in 2011, it looks at 3 cities: Minneapolis, Charlotte, and I'm trying to remember the other one. But the point is that where the employment is where the transit works, and the employment in this city is at the core of the city and up just north of the university. If you look at this city and look at the region, I remember Simon Atkinson, architect at UT, pointed out that there was 50% of the region's employment was within a half a mile of basic Lamar Guadalupe corridor in an area about 50 blocks long. So you want to keep that alive. Now, if you go someplace else with your investment, then eventually people will find that the center is so congested and they can't move. In other words, you neglected the mobility in that area, and therefore by neglecting the mobility, it dies. In other words, you need to, we don't have land use laws, and so what we do have is a very vibrant core. And we need to feed that core, and we need to keep the mobility alive in that core. If you go over and make all these projections over in East Riverside and hope that by building a line out there, all this will happen, you're throwing away what you already have.
Well, see, East Riverside still has very high current employment and population density. It still has a lot of the current factors that you claim are in Lamar. We have a project that's going to start in Lamar in January, next month, and you all haven't even given it a chance. I mean, we've been working for years on implementing and improving that project.
So it's not the project that's being implemented is simply a slightly longer, prettier bus with some amenities on it. It will not go any faster. It will replace the 1L and the 101, but it won't go any faster or get people there any better. So the fact of the matter is we're taking this bus and claiming it'll do all these things. It's just it's the kind of bus service we should have had years ago. But it's no better than what we have in terms of actual delivery of people from point A to point B. Now, if you go in there and put in a lot of concrete bus lanes, and you and I talked about that, if we build bus lanes that
that's how we can improve it. We get it, and that's what we want, and we are working on it.
And once you do that, I wonder what the Congress merchants are going to say when they find that their street is torn up down the middle, just like it would be for rail, to put in concrete bus lanes at $13 million per lane mile, $26 to $27 million, because that's what the numbers show. That's what you guys quote. That's the other part of your rail plan that you're not telling the public about, because along with this is a vast improvement in the bus system, which will preclude the use of these really good rail corridors, because they will now have bus paving
Greg asked, why not do a sensitivity analysis by removing TOI from the calculation to see if it changes the result?
I think it's something we can take under advisement as we suggested. I think that
the explanation problem there is that I'm not going to remove it because I think it's very useful as, in exposing really the basic problem with projection. Let me
Lyndon, is there a data question? I want to see if there's a data question that we have on.
Yeah, I wanted to move to your the whole issue of the physical constraints. And one of the big problems I had with that is you have a table in which you give you identify what you think are physical constraints associated with these sectors, which you're calling subcorridors, and you give them various weights, as you know. I think one that stands out in my mind is that the crossing the rivers is a 4, I believe, and then you give for right-of-way constraints, you give a 5. You get a very heavy penalty. I'll call them those. They're essentially penalties. And then your methodology is it does the right thing, which is to kind of reverse that to sort of get the inverse of that, and you have a calculation which I don't have any problem with. I have several problems with that, but let me lead you to the top one. You assign a penalty to the Lamar sector, which I presume is either Guadalupe, Lamar, or Burnett, or something like that, or maybe you're even thinking of running rail on Shoal Creek or something, because it goes all the way that far over. This huge corridor, this huge sector with multiple travel corridors in it. At any rate, if you assign this to it, you don't assign any such penalty, a constraint. You don't seem to see any kind of a right-of-way constraint in your preferred corridors, which are the ERC, the East Riverside area, and the Highland sector. And I'm wondering why, because those are, to me, are every bit as constrained as the certainly, as a matter of fact, more so in many respects than you'd find with Guadalupe and Lamar.
Well, it sounded like there were two questions there. One was why such a high rating or penalty? I think that if I heard you correctly.
Yes, it's the highest of all the penalties.
And then the other one was, why not the other corridors? So let's start with the rating, if you will, the weight factor. Certainly, crossing Lady Bird Lake is a significant issue. But we recognize that. Again, a lot of this is kind of a surrogate for cost as well. So we ranked each one of these as a significant factor. Constrained right-of-way, if we look up Lamar as just an example, brought that up, we've got a 5-lane cross-section. So we've got two in each way, yeah, at best, in some places tighter, and a turn lane. So the question is, do we take all that right-of-way in order to put in exclusive bus and rail lanes, or do we take away 2 lanes of traffic? Those were the kind of the questions. We looked at some specific street alignments represented in the right. Well, I mean, you buy all the properties. So those are complicated, very time-consuming, very expensive issues. And again, this is a factor that's related to the cost. So we looked at each one of the streets that are generally represented in this area, and we say, well, do we have problems that need to be highlighted as constrained right-of-way? So that's where we identified each one of those. And it's like we have Mopac, Lamar, MLK, South Congress, and South Lamar as constrained rights-of-way. East Riverside, we do have a constrained segment to get from downtown over to I-35. But east of there, all the way out, you've got lots of right-of-way to work with. So we didn't feel that the entire corridor needed to be penalized, like some of the other corridors were constrained all the entire distance. Highland, we felt that we had alternative paths as well. You have airport up north that goes straight up to Highland. You have, obviously, you have railroad right-of-way, not a lot, but you do have some right-of-way that's there. And you do have Red River in those areas. You have I-35 right-of-way you might be able to work with. So we didn't feel quite as concerned with those corridors, looking at those representative streets as we did with some of the others, because, as you mentioned, South Congress as well, very constrained rights of way, and so that's why we assigned those with that particular weighting. This is the one area that we talked about that we did look at representative travel corridors, streets or route alignments, just to get a sense of where could we, it goes back to Susan's comment about where would a reasonable investment go. And so we did look at each one of the subcorridors from that perspective. But that was our thinking in that regard. I mean, you may have different thinking, but that's why we felt that number one, we needed to identify constrained right-of-way as a significant issue as a surrogate for cost, because you're taking away traffic and creating lots of impact, or you're buying lots of property from property owners, potentially damaging the remaining use of those properties, which gets into the big issue.
With a bus anyway.
Pardon? What was that, Dave? That's the thing. We don't know how we're going to do it. What we know is that we need to do what we can to improve the service. That's, to improve Metro Rapid. There may be some areas where we have to buy the right-of-way. There may be areas where we can dedicate a lane, but we haven't. We're still working through that. But for us at this level to make an assumption, I don't think we'll need to expand right-of-way would be wrong. And were we to say we have to expand all of the right-of-way, that would probably be wrong too.
Why not expand that right-of-way for the rail?
That's why we acknowledged it as a fact. The community needs to have that discussion, but we're not, I don't know that we're there yet.
To what extent is this all being driven by this model that I see in the pictures, which is a bunch of streetcars running, down the Red River and across town and up and down and across the river, which will, in my mind, will never give us rapid transit. I mean, stuff that runs on the street doesn't give you rapid transit unless it's complete right-of-way that's been dedicated a long time. Well, it seems to me that what we really need to be looking at is what happens way up north and way down south, and what gets those people down through the center city core in a way that's really productive. If you want to take the Moeller, Red River, East Riverside corridor for 50th of the money, you could put in another bus rapid transit city within system within 2 years, and the thing will be running, and it'll do essentially everything the street cars will do. Until you get to a real dedicated right-of-way, and I think through the center core, it's probably going to be going underground.
Someday it will.
Which is, and the point is, if you start building stuff on the surface and street cars, you're never going to get to what you really need, which is something rapid through the downtown core area from about 35th Street to across the river, and let that be a common leg that can serve all directions, ultimately. Then once you get up there, figure out where you're going to go. Are you going to go to the mall, or are you going to go on to Round Rock? Where's it going to go? But you've got to have a center core that's robust that will support the city for 20 or 30 years. And a bunch of streetcars running around the city streets, in my mind, isn't going to do it. And that's what's driving the economic study and your studies you show up on the screen. I think you're studying the wrong thing.
That's not driving it right now. In fact, we don't have any kind of mode in mind other than this is a high-capacity transit investment. The question is, what are the characteristics that allow us to point it in a particular direction? Now, we move into phase 2 once we identify that direction, and we can start doing exactly as you said. We can bracket it as wide as you want. We can say, okay, we can go all the way from 35th all the way to Riverside in a subway. There's one cost. Now we can put it.
Expensive, but
it is expensive.
Created something that will serve the city and the whole regional area, not just the city, but the regional area for 20 or 30 years.
But But that's one bracket. And the concern that we have too is being able to propose a project that will allow us to be able to proceed, get to the next step.
Bus rapid transit in 2 years from Waller to the airport will do exactly the thing.
That's the other end of the bracket.
Do for 50 times more money. And
well, we haven't proposed. I mean, it's not taking a step back from mode. Mode is something that we're going to look at in more detail in phase 2. But and whether if we were to assume subway for all of them, that would change the constraint matrix. If we just assumed everything was going to be completely grade separated one way or another, that would be a way to approach it. We don't think realistically. I mean, if you look at newer systems throughout the country, they're all on the surface because the appetite for funding just isn't there. The ability.
But so many good systems have the thing on the surface where it's practical, and they take some key areas and they get them out of the traffic area.
But that's the kind of thing you get into that level of detail in a phase 2 when you're looking at particular streets and you realize, well, we've got a constraint here that we can't overcome one other way, whether it's a particular light or it's just constrained right of way, and then you look at what you can do. I mean, even Dallas has some underground section, but it's not a subway.
Right.
Phoenix is on the surface. RTD in Denver.
LA.
Well, LA has subway too, though.
Portland's on surface, except where it goes through the mountains.
Right. So for us to assume that we're going to start with a subway is probably a little bit presumptuous or premature at this point. But we definitely,
you gotta make sure whatever you do in the short term doesn't
absolutely
include or make it where you use up all your resources on something that in fact doesn't address your needs. When you had it another way, it was a 50th of the cost that could have done the same thing. And my only second question was, on your right-of-way down Red River, to what extent have you taken into account the fact that 35 basically blocks access, ready access to your system from the east side? I mean, you're going to have little streets that go through, but I mean, here it looks like you can just cut out sort of half of your capability by taking one side of it where you can't have any real development.
Well, as I said, we looked at Red River, we looked at the airport, we looked at the Red Line right-of-way, we looked at I-35. That's when we're looking at the constraints index. If we move into phase 2 with the Highland Corridor, we'll be looking at each one of those, and we'll be examining each one of those trade-offs. Because, again, we want to be able to provide this system plan connections to whether the idea is Highland, we want it, if we're looking at Highland and East Riverside, we still want to be able to connect to going up Lamar and going up to East Austin and going up Miller and going down South Congress. So those are still thinking concepts we have to think about.
35 wasn't that it was a physical constraint to building your system, but it's a physical constraint that will make difficult access from the east side. In Washington, D.C., they put a highway down through the south side of the capital, and there were two parts of town. There's the part north of the highway, and then there's the part south of the highway, and nothing ever got developed there.
Cheyenne did point out, I mean, the Mobility 35 study is also looking at connections across. So, certainly, anything that we do is going to be with an eye towards improving access to whatever is put in. So, it's not completely without.
Yeah, I would like to return on considering the right-of-way question. Well, following up on that, yeah, but
hang on,
you keep jumping from one thing to another. We're on this issue of the right-of-way, and while we're on that, I would like to say, or I'd like to ask you, how, if you're not having a constrained right-of-way and getting up Red River, you're not having a constrained right-of-way getting, by taking traffic lanes out of circulation going to San Jacinto, you're going to maintain the existing street structure on San Jacinto and Red River. And
well, we know UT has already
identify San Jacinto as primarily transit facility. So
they're going to,
we assume
they're fine with getting rid of the street traffic on that. Okay.
Red River, our assumption when we looked at it as a route to Miller, as a potential route to Miller, was that the travel demand, the traffic on that road could potentially be displaced.
Okay. So now, jumping to Guadalupe and Lamar, you're basically saying, oh, well, we can't make that kind of a decision. We can't decide to prioritize transit over private motor vehicles. We've got to make.
We don't think we can assume that. No, we don't think we can assume that. We think that
so that is, seems to me that's a bias in this whole process. That, oh, you're saying, well, over here.
It's not a bias, Lyndon. We just work with what we know. We know what this is what we know.
We've looked at on Red River and San Jacinto, and
it doesn't very near the volume of traffic. It's not near the volume. It's nowhere. You have parallel. You have I-35, which
okay. Well,
so we'll get back to you. Okay, we're giving time to get to everybody else's questions.
Thank you.
Okay, we have a couple of questions that have come in from Twitter. One from Jay. He asks, when you give present day and future data equal weighting, does Lamar end up scoring better than Highland?
Actually, hey, Derek, were you able to look at the TOI? And in case, I think we can probably address both of those, because we were able to do the TOI sensitivity that was suggested. I think the project team.
So, while we're pulling that up, or he's got it up now. Okay.
Yeah. So if you just zero out future and current ridership potential.
Has that been released online? I haven't seen that one before.
No, it hasn't.
Is this the basic decision matrix that you use to?
That is the same as the online survey and evaluation tool. So we've published that in just interactive form.
Is that now published in a way that somebody can just, without running across the survey, can just go straight to it?
No.
Figure with the numbers. That's why this would be very handy if you made this.
But all you have to do is go through the survey one, and then you have it where you can interact with it and jigger with it all you want. You just have to go through it one.
I want to go back now. Do I have to keep on taking the survey over and over again?
Every session, if you will, yes, you would have to take.
So, in the interest of openness and transparency, which you mentioned earlier, which I think you've been really good at, I think it would be great if something along these lines were made available as well.
Well, we'll certainly consider it, but you know, the more that we put out there, it also creates a lot of questions. I mean, it's not so easy to just dump things out there without providing context, without providing, you know, directions or instructions on how to use it, and explanations on how things are done. So we'll certainly consider it.
I mean, this is something that I'm on the customer satisfaction advisory committee for Capital Metro, and we're getting ready to discuss this issue. And we want to actually run our own numbers. We want this kind of tool so that collectively, as a group, we can run the numbers. I guess that gives me a lot of hope.
Yeah. Are those numbers at the very top? The top row. Are they your final?
Those are rankings. The rankings are the white numbers at the top.
Yeah, and then the second one down are the final scores.
Can you zero them as opposed to making them one?
You can zero them. Get it down the outline tool. You can't
Are those
zero them to take them out?
are those are total what?
Their totals of each of the 35 is a total of the for each of the 5 problems, the 16, the 2, the 2, the 12. So Lamar actually drops when you take out ridership potential, both current and future, in its ranking and its score.
Okay.
So then the other question was about current and future.
POI.
Or Jason's question was about
when you give present day and future data equal weight, does Lamar end up scoring better than Highland?
No. But when we give everything equal weight, that's a different scenario. That's the one further right. It's just the one next to the public, I think.
When we weight everything equally,
Then Lamar is 4.
Lamar goes a little bit.
Lower than what the project team had scored it with our weighting.
He's actually not including into the webinar, so you repeat that.
Lamar drops to 4, which is lower than the project team.
Well, he can. He would just. We want to direct him to refer to the equal weighting. Yeah, the equal weighting.
So the other question was, when you include West Campus within the Lamar subcorridor, does Lamar end up scoring better than Highland?
That one we have in here, so we can look at that.
When West Campus is included into the Lamar subcorridor.
Aaron, y'all ran that analysis, right?
Yeah, I know I looked at it. Hang on.
No, it's not.
Exactly.
Yeah, we did against the
data and economic development.
Well, one thing that Dan Cashet on his website, and I forget the name of it right off, I think Austin on Your Feet, I think that's what it is. He points out that you're weighting projections by about something like 3 to 1 to current data, and he's looking specifically at congestion, your congestion data that you're using. You're doing it in 2 ways. One, you're giving congestion. I think you're giving a weight of 3% to the current data, and you're giving a weight of 5% to the 2030 data, and then you're giving the difference, which is basically accounts for a presumption of this enormous growth of 4% increase, 4%. So you're giving out of a total of 12 percentage points, you're giving only three of those to current data. And to me, it just seems like there's one thing after the other, and you know, you'll come back and you'll justify where you're doing that, and your projections are just great.
Planning is about growth.
Of course, it's about growth. All of that. I'm a ridership forecaster. I mean, you know, what is forecasting? It's not about growth, but it's about realistic growth and using conservative and realistic and plausible estimates.
But hang on. So separate that. Okay. You take issue with our methodologies for making those projections. Okay. Let's set that aside. Should we be looking at growth?
To some
Is it important?
It is important. It is important. And something like this, I would say, would be weighted less, considerably less than current conditions, because you don't growth is very unpredictable, and especially when you start getting.
He doesn't say it's very unpredictable. They
realize it is.
Projections based on current data is more reliable. But they recognize the need to size and develop projects for the future.
That implies that there's some risk and there's some unpredictability. They say
they're not saying it's unpredictable. I mean, the future is certainly unpredictable. But they're saying that ridership forecast based on current data is more reliable. And I don't think, none of us are disputing that. We recognize that there is...
You get so much more, you're giving the future, and these projection so much more weight.
3 versus 5%. I don't think that that's really tipping the scale.
Yes, but you're also then giving extra weight to the projected increase. You're not only saying that the future value is that much, but then you take the difference and say and give that extra weight.
So Dan and I had this discussion when we met with the Oracle board last week or 2 weeks ago. One of the things was he gave, I think, actually what helped me understand his question better was he gave a very simple example that I'll try and talk you through because it was a table. You have two things, A and B. Both A and B in current. A was 10, B was 5. And in the future, A was 20, B was 20. And he said, A would appear to me to have more problems, like if you were looking at congestion. So A congestion is worse now, and in the future it will be even worse. B is not as worse now, it's not as bad now, but will be just as worse in the future. Right? So just on that basis alone, he felt, well, no, you should drive your resources towards A, because it's bad now, and it's going to be bad in the future.
And you know it.
And I said,
you know it's bad now, and it's reasonable to predict some incremental increase at least into the future.
Right. From our vantage, though, we're saying that A, where it is already worse now, is already surviving. It's maybe better equipped to handle a smaller increase in the future. Whereas B, which is at 5 now and is going to be 20 in the future, is just as likely, for instance, as A is to be 20 in the future, is less well-equipped to handle it. So that's one of the reasons growth change is a problem for people. And so we felt that looking at growth and trying to understand where that's happening and what's driving it is in some regards more important than current. We still did equal weightings.
So let me
did scenarios with equal weightings.
Let me move to another.
Roger's been trying to say something.
But this person's been waiting since your 5 of your questions ago. So let me get to that one if you don't mind, Roger. And then okay. So let me get to it's another one from Susan, I believe. Susan, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you if you want to ask what you had your hand up a minute ago. You there, Susan?
Yes, thanks. Can you talk about a little bit the use of the I-35 ridership data, including that in the Highland subcorridor? And specifically what I'm asking about is, are you assuming, how is that ridership data going to fit in with the high-capacity transit? So are you assuming that people will get off I-35, use a park and ride, and then take the rail downtown? And if you are assuming that, are you including, the cost and the land and everything to build the park and ride? How is that going to work? Or are you assuming that this high-capacity transit might be built on the I-35 access road and in that way absorb the traffic on I? I'm just wondering, and other people have been wondering online, what kind of assumptions you're making about that traffic and how that affects the corridor, subcorridor.
Susan, are you referring to the congestion data related to I-35 and the use of the inclusion of highways in the congestion data as opposed to ridership? Because we're not really looking at, ridership. We've looked at existing transit ridership based on boardings, and we've looked at potential ridership based on land use. So are you referring to the congestion data for highways?
I guess I'm asking a more broad question, and I guess from what you're saying, the congestion data is where you've used the I-35, but I don't know if you've thought through, or if you have thought through, you haven't really made public, like how that ridership on I-35 is going to affect the actual project. And, you know, for example, why is it more important in the Highland Corridor than in the Lamar Corridor when, you know, just as, this is just an example, I know it goes back to Lamar, but, you know, a lot of people use Lamar Guadalupe as an alternative to I-35, more so even than they use, you know, Red River or something. So I'm confused about, you know, how you're evaluating that. I just...
Yeah, this is Kyle. Let me jump in, and Scott and Jerry can follow appropriately. We have not assumed any ridership from I-35 in our calculations. What we have done is we've looked at congestion factors. Again, this is percent of lane miles of congestion, vehicle miles traveled, vehicle hours of travel, all of those factors related to all of the major streets in each of the sub-corridors. In the case of Highland and moving on down Miller and East Austin, all the way down to East Riverside, I-35 was a roadway that went through those corridors. We did include, for those segments, we did include the congestion and the traffic figures in that because it's a dominant factor. It's an important factor in the determining the characteristics of each one of the travel corridors that are there. So we did look at that. We did take the traffic, not ridership. We did look at the auto traffic characteristics in each one of those sub-corridors. Now, as we move toward phase 2, Susan, and we look at specific alignments and specific opportunities to be able to intercept traffic off of I-35, that's a very reasonable scenario that you laid out. We would want to be able to connect with I-35 to provide an alternative to those motorists to be able to jump onto a high-capacity transit investment to get to their destination. It doesn't mean everyone's going to do it, but it's an alternative that folks would have to be able to get off of I-35, take the high-capacity transit to get down into the downtown area, the Capitol Complex. But that's a phase 2 consideration that will define what that specific alignment would be, what kind of facilities we would put in, such as a park and ride, how it would relate to the North Corridor investments that are going to be made there, how it would relate to the red line investments that are already in place. That's an important nexus for us, actually, up in the Highland area. There's a lot of things that come together there that we're excited about, and it was one of the reasons that we suggested adding the Highland sub-corridor to our recommendation to be able to build out that system and to be able to see a lot of connecting linkages in that area. But we have not looked at, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, Jerry and Scott, we have not looked at any potential ridership or even numbers of cars and people that would be diverted off of I-35 and Highland at this point in time. We just recognize that as we move into the next phase, that's going to be an important consideration that we want to evaluate. Does that help? I'm not sure if I can help with your question or confusion, but I did want to make sure that you understood, Susan, that we haven't looked at any ridership, but we did look at the motoring traffic, the automobile traffic congestion factors on I-35.
And when we do get into phase 2 and when we're doing ridership modeling, we will be able to look at drive access, walk access, to the alignments that we consider.
Okay, I just want to say again that I think it's problematic to assign the congestion from I-35 to Highland, for example, and not to Lamar. I mean, I just, you know, because that's where you drew the sub-corridor, and, you know, where Lamar is, neither MOPAC nor I-35 is included in consideration. So
You guys did a analysis for that.
So where we took out the highways congestion altogether.
And there was little
right,
impact.
yeah, I saw
Yeah,
that.
it didn't really change the overall.
Right.
But yeah, Roger, been waiting.
So a quick comment and then a question. The comment is that there's a famous thing in history, I'm not sure which university it was, the way they built their sidewalks was they said, we're just going to let everybody trample through wherever they want on the grass, and then we know exactly where you know, what the travel demand is and the path that they want to take, right? But
That's been done at numerous universities, Indiana
and then you construct your sidewalk. I think that that's something to consider. That perspective is something to consider in the context of the sort of argument made here about future demand versus existing demand. But regardless of that, my question is, regarding the congestion on I-35, the congestion of traffic on I-35, is there any analysis of that with respect to who is actually traveling in the core or to and from the core?
Yes, we looked at everything from, this was actually from Martha's request. We had to go back and do a lot of other additional analysis on the origin and destination of the number of individuals that were actually traveling outside the central corridor area through the various corridors to the core, or outside the area through the sub-corridors and through the core to beyond. And we also looked at it if they're going just from outside the areas and just ending in those sub-corridors. So we looked at all iterations of that from a regional perspective.
But in terms of congestion, did you control or did you adjust the congestion factors based on that? In other words, if I-35 were congested because everybody was traveling, you know, from Dallas to San Marcos, and that was accounting for all of the congestion, then it's not reasonable to assume that they're going to hop on a train midway through that trip and then hop off a train and
rent a car.
Right. But we do know that most of that congestion on most of the traffic on I-35 is local. That's what TxDOT has determined. It's not it's not NAFTA highway traffic.
Well, yeah, that was an exaggeration.
Right. But that is a kind of an assumption going into it.
15% is through traffic, of course, you're doing the Texas Transportation Institute. The traffic, she says, is from southern Hayes County to northern Williamson County, the 85%. So it's honestly pretty well focused on the core of the city, but of course it's going a lot of other places too.
Oh yeah, and we did those kind of spider maps early on that had those origins and destinations mapped, and that was confusing.
Yeah, our entire travel demand index, Roger, is built on that. It's from the subcorridor to the core and regional to the core now and in the future.
And that's going back to how we started this. You know, we assumed we have radial travel patterns. We mapped it. That confirmed that the core was kind of this common element to all of the subcorridors. The OD maps demonstrated that. So that was reinforced there. And so that there are trips throughout the region, but this study is really just focused on central corridor and a core in particular.
Early on in the study, when you saw the things that were up there on the screen and everything, we actually had the core listed separately by itself, just for comparison purposes. And we took it out for two reasons. One, because it's common to all of the sectors of the sub-corridors, so it's a wash. But the second thing is it absolutely dwarfs everything else that is going on. And it speaks to your point, Dave, about the part of the core and making sure that it's mobile and have a system. We have to create a system in here that creates that mobility within that area. It's just amazing when you look at the growth, the existing and the growth within the core itself. It's just phenomenal. It blows everything away.
There was a scaling problem. We couldn't be able to show the differences in the sub-corridors because everything was way up here and it was a little bit of noise.
But here's the problem back to some of the things that Lyndon was pointing out. You have to look at all of the trips, not just home-based work trips.
We did.
You have to look at the fact that your core area is too narrowly defined, because your core really it goes up through the center of the city. I traveled up Lamar last night at Rush House, and then I got off into those neighborhoods north of 183 because I got lost. I couldn't see the sign. I made a wrong left turn when I wanted to go down Breaker. I ended up going down Meadowood. And the densities out there are just phenomenal. And those are riders people. And those are the people, a lot of them, trying to get into the core, various points in the core. And that's the point. You can build out to the future out East Riverside. But the fact is, the problem is in those internal commuters. Those internal commuters coming down on the current bus ride lines. And if you want to do future growth, then you repurpose the rail line and you take in islands.
East Riverside has so many of those same current, transit-supportive land uses and populations and density.
They have the future is there.
No, it's now. No, the future is there, but it does well with current, too. It still finishes, when we looked at only serving criteria, only like current-based criteria, East Riverside still finished highest.
Yeah, but that's because you have cherry-picked the data. I can't. I'll just give it that characterization. You shake your head no, and I know you agree to disagree on that.
What did we cherry-pick? Please tell me.
Well, for one thing, the transit data. The transit data, you're basically dealing with an area where you've got multiple trips coming in from different directions and so forth. That's one thing that's there. The other thing is that that's an area.
But East Riverside is probably a good example where that's not likely.
Excuse me, but the way you've handled the data, for example, you're only dealing with home-based work trips, and then you separate out the intra-corridor trips from what you're calling intra-corridor, which are really inter-sector trips, which are going